I travel all over the world, and even if I could not communicate with someone, I could just draw the Twin Towers on a business card or on a napkin. Oh, and everyone would know what that is.
It was also in the background of all the shots. It was the way to look at New York from a distance and say, oh, that must be New York, there's the twins.
It is America that invented the skyscraper and had an influence all over the world.
To the world at large, when they come to New York, what they want to see are skyscrapers. The density, the height of New York. And nothing emphasized this more than the Twin Towers.
Many people around the world saw them as symbols of New York's dominance, and in fact the United States' dominance. If you look at it from a distance, or looked at it from a distance, you could almost see it as a gateway made by a race of giants.
The idea for a World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan first begins in the 1940s, but really gets picked up in the 1960s, and it's very closely associated with the interests of the Rockefeller family in both building big, which was something the Rockefellers loved to do, and with preserving Lower Manhattan.
When Nelson Rockefeller, who is the true father of the World Trade Center, believed in what he called catalytic bigness, the idea that large amounts of money applied to urban situations or almost any kind of situation would automatically produce widespread social good. We had seen what building big and thinking big, everything from the Hoover Dam to the Empire State, these were good. We were big, we were good, big was good.
David Rockefeller knew the world was going global, and he said New York has to be the center of international trade. World Trade Center would be the means to do that. Represented, you know, the beginning of globalization.
The strength of Lower Manhattan had always been related with trade. It was right there on the meeting of the East River and the Hudson Rivers. And so in order to make this focus on trade effective, we should probably have a trade center.
It was a place where small, medium-sized businesses, not big international, multinational companies, but small businesses that wanted to get involved in international trade could come and learn how to do that.
The Chase Manhattan Bank, which was closely allied with David Rockefeller, had built a new building to establish the fact that they were going to be there in Lower Manhattan, and the Rockefellers were very interested in making sure that other businesses stayed in Lower Manhattan and that the economy of Lower Manhattan would be stabilized. So they were very much behind the idea of building a World Trade Center.
Up until that point in time, Lower Manhattan did not have a Class A office space market. Class A office space was in Midtown Manhattan.
At that time, a lot of people were moving to Midtown, a lot of businesses, and we felt that it was necessary to keep downtown as well.
Banks and financial firms and corporate offices were moving to Midtown, and by the 1960s, a lot of corporate offices were moving out of New York altogether.
The city was under siege. You remember it was the mid-70s. A lot of people were leaving the city, and suddenly they said, we believe in the city. We have faith in New York.
My brother Nelson was then governor of New York. He took a great interest in this as well. Since it was to be for the Port of New York, the Port of New York Authority would be the one to build it.
All of a sudden, the Port Authority, this government agency, constructs the World Trade Center and dumps 10 million square feet of space.
10 million square feet of office space on a 16-acre plot, approximately 12 square blocks. The design directive came down, and it was, build us something that will be noticed.
Then it was a question of who would build it and how we'd go about it. There was a competition. A distinguished Japanese architect, Mr. Yamasaki, was selected.
Yamasaki had designed several small buildings that had been very, very well received, and he was considered a very progressive architect, and he was introducing a new ornamental vocabulary to modern design. And this appealed to the Port Authority. Most of his buildings were in Michigan, so he wasn't that well known in New York. Yamasaki made many, many plans and proposals. He once envisioned one enormous tower, and finally came up with this notion of twin towers on a large plaza. There was no intention to build the tallest buildings in New York initially. At a certain point, the Port Authority became very enthusiastic about the idea of the world's tallest building. It was great public relations. New York was a place where there had been the world's tallest building for most of the 20th century. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the Woolworth Building. It was well within the idea of what a New York skyscraper should be. The plans were announced, and all of the optimism evaporated. The critics were almost universally opposed to the buildings, and there was a lot of opposition from people in New York City. They just didn't capture the imagination right away. It was interesting as a great engineering feat, but it was not particularly famous as a great work of architecture at the time.
Everybody who participated in the development of the idea was very pleased. It did focus trade, international trade particularly, in two major buildings, and it certainly became a major item for anyone coming to New York.
When the buildings were completed, some critics dubbed them David and Nelson, just as a reference to the fact that the Rockefellers had been so important in the design of the Twin Towers.
In the mid-70s, they were a white elephant. They became gray, you know, in the mid-80s, and they became a big moneymaker, a big profit center. As the financial markets started expanding, the Trade Center was the place where that expansion could take place. They had a place to go.
And Rockefeller believed very strongly in that world peace would occur through international trade.
Instead of fighting with one another, we will be so closely bound by links of trade that we wouldn't dare go to war with anyone because we just need each other too much.
There's, of course, a certain irony to this now with the devastation and the disaster at the World Trade Center, that perhaps it didn't bring about understanding among the people of the world. But this was an idea that really ran through the Rockefellers.
What people didn't realize, that it was opening another era. In a sense, it was announcing the 21st century.
Stay tuned. New York Stories will return right here, only on Metro TV. Now back to New York Stories, right here on Metro TV.
The Twin Towers were built because the Port Authority overcame at least 3 important engineering problems. One problem is the foundation. Whenever you dig a hole in lower Manhattan, it's going to fill up with water because of its proximity to the Hudson River.
The site is landfill on the edge of the Hudson River. And to put among the tallest buildings in the world on this landfill right by the river requires a very special kind of foundation to make sure that water doesn't come in and other things don't happen. This huge concrete tub, in effect, which in fact they called the bathtub, was built.
Actually, it's a reverse bathtub, because the purpose of this bathtub was to keep the water out rather than keep the water in. The way this was done was to use clamshell diggers to create a 3-foot wide trench in 70-foot sections. It would be filled up with bentonite, which is a slurry substance, and then gradually over time, concrete would be pumped in at the bottom and the bentonite would be taken out at the top, and this provided a bathtub which was 400 feet wide and 800 feet long, allowing construction of the center to take place without worrying about its flooding.
Bathtub. It was built around all the existing path and subway train lines while they kept going, and became a source of support for the towers.
A second big problem that the Twin Towers had to overcome was its unique mode of construction. Most skyscrapers are built with many supporting vertical columns in the core of the building. The Twin Towers is different. The Twin Towers has the support piers on the exterior of the building.
The outside of the building was a mesh of steel. It actually supported the whole thing. In a way, it's almost like those steel litter baskets that you see on the sidewalks around New York, kind of a mesh of steel that's really quite strong. This is kind of the same idea, but taken to 110 stories.
This resulted in its unusual exterior appearance. Remember, the windows of the World Trade Center were only 22 inches wide. This is because there was so much steel in the exterior.
Trade Center represented, I think, the equivalent of Mount Everest or K2 or something like that in ironworkers' minds. These things were just the epitome, the absolute height of what ironworkers did. I mean, we did 40-story buildings all the time, so that was no big deal. But the concept of 1,300 feet and 2 of them was just mind-boggling, because we knew that this was what we were supposed to do. And so guys that worked on the Trade Center were somewhat envied from the other guys, because that was the quote-unquote the big job. That was it. That was the climbing the big mountain. These buildings are done by hand. I know that sounds silly when you look at a 50 or 100-story building and you say it's built by hand, but it's literally built by hand. No, the steel isn't lifted by hand, but all the other work is absolutely done by hand. So to get around, you have no choice but to literally climb columns and walk on beams and do all that stuff. Connectors, they are the guys who have to climb the columns, and then the crane or derrick picks up the steel. And there's a fellow on the end called a tagline man. He has a rope with a hook, and he steers the beam to one connector. They make the steel go to exactly where it has to go. When it gets very, very close, the 2 connectors then take control of it. You line up a set of holes that's pre-drilled in the beam. By lining those things up, the beam goes into place. That beam is considered made. The choker is thrown down. The crane or derrick is then repositioned over the next beam to go up. And so the connectors are the guys, they have to be moving, so they literally cannot tie on any safety lines, and they have to be extremely agile and and quick-witted because the danger factor is extraordinary. It's very macho-oriented. It's extremely macho. You go on the job, and there's a bunch of guys there doing a job that is so improbable to begin with. It's so difficult. And the way to get respect in ironworking is to do the job well. Well, one of the ways to do it well is to take risks. And the more at peace you are with it, the more comfortable you are with taking risks, the better in ironwork you are. So then it gets into this thing of who can take more risks. And it becomes part of the nature of an ironworker.
All the vertical loads were supported on the exterior wall, so it was a very unique structure. And then there was a truss system that connected that to the core of the building, and the truss system let you have column-free space in the World Trade Center.
They created floors of practically an acre, albeit the middle of the floor was filled with the services, the bathrooms, the elevator shafts. But the floors were, you could get a space almost 200 feet long by 60 feet wide without any columns at all in it.
The only other beams that were in that building were nothing more than bar joists. It's just bars and angle iron, and all it has to do is hold up a section of this floor. It's very, very light. It takes the place of a beam, but it doesn't have near the strength of a beam. Their only function was to support the floor and to tie the inner core and the outer core together. On top of which were steel decking and then concrete.
The third major engineering development of the Twin Towers had to do with the elevatoring system. Prior to the Twin Towers, no skyscraper had been built much beyond 60 or 70 stories tall. And the reason for this is that the taller the building, the more tenants. The more tenants, the more need for elevators. The more elevators, the less rentable space. And so you reach a point of diminishing returns where the building is so full of elevators, you have no office space to rent out.
Port Authority engineer by the name of Herb Tesla came up with this sky lobby concept. And the sky lobby concept said, why not treat the building like you would the subway system? You have express cars and local cars, right, subway? So they took the World Trade Center and they stacked 3 buildings on top of one another. Then they had local elevator banks that served the first third of the building. Then the second third was served by an express elevator to the second. And then the third zone was served by an express elevator to the third zone.
Elevators were on top of other elevators, so that if you were going to one of the upper floors, you would take a sort of an express to somewhere in the middle of the building and switch to a local elevator to your floor. So in effect, it was like 3 different buildings, one on top of the other, which meant much less space had to be devoted to elevator shafts all the way through the building, freeing up a lot more space for other purposes and making the building much more economical.
That concept is used today in all super high-rise buildings. And they do variations of it, but basically that concept was created by a Port Authority engineer. I would tell people that if you took the blood out of a World Trade Department person and examined it, you would see little twin towers in there. It was the greatest place to work.
Every day you had a 35-minute lunch break. So every day I would sit in the corner with my feet dangling over. So it was just nice. You could just sit there very safely and with your feet hanging over and have almost a 270-degree view of Lower Manhattan. And what I learned to do was every day I would rotate clockwise one corner of the building and have a different view. And it was much like if somebody had a wonderful toy train set and you stood up with your full height and looked down at this marvelous Lower Manhattan view. And every day I would do a different corner and I was methodical going around clockwise. And I knew that this was going to be very rare, and because after they covered it up, nobody else would ever do that again.
Well, there was something pretty exhilarating about being at the top of the World Trade Center, because you felt as much as if you were in an airplane as if you were in a building, and yet you were in an airplane that was stopped in space.
When you stood on top of the World Trade Center, I felt like King Kong, because there were little planes out there I could just grab, little boats out there. It was so tiny.
The towers were a constant reminder that one had come to one of the most extraordinary, most powerful cities in the world.
They were a symbol of Wall Street, of American capitalism, of American finance, and consequently, the entire American way of life.
Their importance, I don't think, was architectural. It was really cultural. They became an icon of New York, and they became an icon particularly to non-New Yorkers.
Stay tuned. New York Stories will return right here, only on Metro TV. Now back to New York Stories, right here on Metro TV.
Architectural critics felt that these towers were plain, banal, boring, uninteresting, lacked decorative detail.
I thought these were dull, boring, ordinary buildings. They were huge, but they didn't seem to have anything about them other than bigness and height.
The idea that this thing was not attractive, well, not to ironworkers. The ironworkers, this thing was wonderful. This was really the best thing that could happen to us, because it showed what we could do.
When they first went up, I hated them. They were never the kind of buildings that would make people's face light up and say, oh, I love that place, the way people say, I love the Chrysler Building, I love the Woolworth Building, I love the Plaza Hotel, I love Central Park. The World Trade Center never quite did that for people. It was big. It was the biggest thing.
People by the 70s were getting pretty sick of these very tall buildings with these very sleek facades. And the idea of being the tallest and the biggest was beginning to look a little bit embarrassing. The ecological movement was coming along. People were saying things like small is beautiful. A lot of people were thinking about going back to nature, not going to the city. So this seemed to stand for the exact opposite.
When the buildings were first constructed, the New York Times called them a revolutionary dinosaur.
The buildings were a revolutionary dinosaur because they represented a lot of advances in structural engineering. But they were a dinosaur because buildings that big, mega skyscrapers, didn't really make a lot of sense. If they did, real estate developers would be putting them up all the time, all over the place. It didn't fill up with commercial tenants until many, many, many years later.
It took so long to build them that they were representing a style of architecture that people had already said had been tried and failed. The idea of this great big tower in a wide open space. I always think of them as kind of gawky teenagers who have a flat top crew cut by the 1970s when everybody else had a beard and hair down to their shoulders. So these buildings kind of came along after their time. And I think that's one of the reasons why when they first were built, that they really got a lot of slings and arrows.
Not only were they criticized for architectural reasons, but everyone seemed to have a gripe. The steel makers complained that 25% of the steel was imported from Japan, and therefore the buildings were un-American. Landlords complained that the Port Authority, an agency of government, was providing unfair competition in the real estate market. Environmentalists were particularly upset. In the early 70s, the Twin Towers were pumping 170,000 gallons of raw sewage per day into the Hudson River. Environmentalists were also upset because at the time the buildings were designed, in the late 60s, energy was inexpensive. And there were no light switches. The light simply burned night and day. As energy became more expensive, the tenants complained to the Port Authority. They wanted to have switches. The Port Authority says, you want switches? We'll give you switches, but it'll cost you $142 per switch.
When I was down there as an operational supervisor, I used to have to go out at night when all these critics were criticizing the Port Authority and the World Trade Center for not being prudent with energy. I had to go out at 7 o'clock, at 8 o'clock, at 9 o'clock, at 10 o'clock with a camera and photograph the complex. I'd go on the north side, the south side, and just take photographs to show that the lighting was down, you know, the lighting was in fact going off.
Even the bird lovers were upset because the birds were coming down from Canada on the flyways, crashing into the side of the Twin Towers and falling dead on the plaza.
So people didn't understand it, couldn't grasp it, and the easy thing to say is, oh, they're horrible. You know, because they probably didn't know what you could do with them, or they probably didn't understand what the potential of that complex was. And if I believe firmly that if the Trade Center hadn't been there, the financial markets would have left New York City in a heartbeat.
They became efficient buildings, and I think that they contributed to the city.
I think the negative attitude when they were built proved that they were probably ahead of their time. And indeed, over the years, time proved them right.
The affectionate attitude towards them really started to come in the 1980s when people had had a chance to get used to them. They'd made enough jokes about them being the Ronzoni spaghetti boxes or whatever.
Eventually you come to think of those two huge things as like minimalist sculpture. And the two big, tall boxes did sort of talk to each other in a weird way. It was much better that there were two of them than one of them. It's kind of weird, actually, the idea of something that's dull and not very interesting, but better that there's twice as much of it. That's sort of strange. Usually we don't think of things like that.
You react to identical twin children. There's a kind of strange attraction, you know, that it's something you're interested in, something that has a tight relationship.
But I would maintain that the trouble with all these criticisms, valid though they may be, they overlook a kind of subtle beauty that the Twin Towers possessed. We have to remember that these Twin Towers were not just two Twin Towers side by side. Instead, they were offset. As you're walking around Lower Manhattan, you could see a kind of subtle shape-shifting and interplay between the two towers, which I think was very important. It was a subtle kind of beauty.
The real twinness was obvious, because from some views, you only saw one tower. And from other views, you saw the two, but if it was from a certain direction, it almost looked like one building. And then from another direction, you'd see that sliver of blue space, you know, that's so perfectly straight, you know, 110 stories. It was just dramatic.
You would see them from so many unexpected places in New York, because they were so big and so shiny, and so there, and yet in a certain way, very quiet. and there would just be this enormous gleaming presence that would sort of poke up at the end of a street or over a church steeple or down an avenue, and you would see it, and there they were, and it really is like being in a medieval village, and there you see the cathedral spire from all sorts of funny angles from the fields outside the village or the little town square or down a crooked alley, and you look and suddenly there it is. Well, the Trade Center was sort of like that for New York. It became a church spire that you could see from all over the city, and in those unexpected glimpses and even a bit of sunshine would glisten off the reflective outside of it, and then it would sort of be all right. It would actually be kind of nice, and it would be a sort of benign presence. And you wouldn't think of it then as this enormous, not terribly friendly skyscraper. It would in fact become this welcoming spire that connected to everything in New York and brought it together.
One fundamental reason why the Twin Towers gradually won the hearts and minds of New Yorkers had to do with the fact that it's a basic human instinct. Whenever we're confronted with a tall building, just like we're confronted with a mountain, our instinct is to go to the top. Port Authority, in its wisdom, gave us not one, but two ways to get to the top, because remember, these are the Twin Towers. Owen Quinn, he parachuted off of the tower onto the plaza below. George Willig, the 27-year-old toy maker from Queens, he had studied the Twin Towers, and he built a special apparatus which had a device which fit into the channels for the window washing equipment. He designed it in such a way that if he was pulling down on this device, it would clamp and lock. On the other hand, it would loosen if he tried to raise it. So he was able to scale the buildings. The first of these daredevil accomplishments of the 1970s was the Frenchman Philippe Petit, who back in the early 70s got together with some of his Confederates and dressed as workmen. They got their equipment up to 2 floors right below the top the day before, and then very early in the morning, about 6 in the morning, they were able to use a 5-foot crossbow and to shoot a nylon fishing line across from the North Tower to the South Tower, where they had other Confederates waiting for them. Gradually, they were able to pay out a very big rope, a tight rope, for Philippe Petit to walk across.
The wind would hit the North Tower, and then the wind would also hit the South Tower, then bounce off the South Tower and hit the North Tower. So you not only had the one wind force hitting it, but you had the reflection of wind coming off the South. So it actually got hit twice. And it would just make that building really rock and roll and twist and turn. And it's supposed to do that. That's what the building was designed to do. It wasn't a movement that was like this, vertical, very stiff thing that just moved. It moved like a sine wave almost, and twisted and turned.
I don't care if you go up there every day for 10 years and measure the wind. The day Philippe Petit strung his cable and went between the towers, you could have lit a cigarette and the wind wouldn't have blown out the match. It was God looking out over, somebody looking out over Philippe Petit. It was impossible to predict that he was going to, and he didn't choose it. I guess to a certain extent he chose the day, but there was no way he could have anticipated that there would be no wind a quarter mile in the air. No way. And so if that wasn't divine providence, I don't know what was. What a day to do it.
About 7:15 in the morning, he started walking across this tightrope, and The office workers and the police looked up. Everybody filled the streets. It created a tremendous traffic jam. And he didn't walk across just once. He walked across 6 or 7 times. Finally, the Port Authority police were able to talk him into coming off because they were threatening to send a helicopter to pluck him off, and he was worried that the downdraft from the helicopter would topple him.
Stay tuned. New York Stories will return right here, only on Metro TV. Now back to New York Stories, right here on Metro TV.
I had a backstage tour of the building by a Port Authority official, and as we were going up these stairs, he pointed to the initials that a workman had left in the concrete steps. And he named them by name, pointed out the initials, pointed out the date, 1970, and said, "Look at this." He said, "Here is this man's initials, and these initials will be here forever."
If I were at the base of that building when the fire trucks pulled up and a chief said to me, "Oh, what should we do? Is there any danger of this thing collapsing?" I would have said, "There's no danger of this thing collapsing," because I know how flimsy a plane is versus the outer wall of steel on this building. So I really thought the building would absorb it. I didn't consider the lingering effects of that thick jet fuel. Nobody figured that that much fuel would burn for that long. Bar joists probably failed from the heat. Bar joists are what supported all the floors. This is not thick steel. It's a zigzag series of bars with angle irons welded to it, and it's much more susceptible to heat than a beam would have been. And eventually, the bar joist would collapse and cascading down one on top of another. I'll be curious to see what the engineers say about using bar joists again as a floor supports.
The intense heat of 2,000 degrees from thousands and thousands of gallons of jet fuel exploding and burning. There's really no way to protect a building from something like that unless you built the pyramids, unless you built something that's just nothing but a pile of stone, and you couldn't have thousands of people work in something like that.
When the Port Authority built the World Trade Center, it did not have to build the Trade Center according to New York Fire Code or New York Building Code.
The original Trade Center was built without any sprinkler system. And the reason for that is that it was too much floor space. You'd have to have a reservoir of water, an enormous reservoir of water, for a sprinkler system for the trade centers. So the compromise they came up with was to double sheetrock all the walls. One of the reasons that there was so much dust following a collapse was that there was double sheetrock in the entire building.
Who knows whether fire inspectors were ever in there to really check this thing out.
It's expected to be there forever, certainly. We're not used to seeing the skyline change in a cataclysmic way like this. Skylines grow slowly over time. And if they change, if buildings come down, they come down slowly too most of the time.
We saw them in front of our eyes being pulverized, disintegrated in just a few seconds. So suddenly you see that building are as fragile as human life. You know, I always have thought that building, unless you wanted really to do something wrong to them, would stand forever. And suddenly that fragility, I think, made us very aware of our own fragility, and by association made them feel they were part of us.
The things we built and believed would stand forever can turn to dust in a heartbeat. That is something that will take us a long time to wrap ourselves around.
This is nearly a 10-acre site. They didn't destroy the two towers, they destroyed the two towers, a number of buildings, a lot of open space. A train station, a big piece of the city. There's no one thing that's going to go back there.
And the destruction of the tower, for me, it's not a question of the towers. It's the question of the city. And it's an attack on the city.
They were not chosen by accident. They were a symbol of New York and capitalism. And for the bombers, they symbolized something really that they couldn't take very positively about New York.
And now, of course, the towers became martyrs. When the towers went down in this horrendous and awful way, they became the first skyscraper martyrs that have ever been. It is an amazing thing to walk up and down the streets and see vendors on the sidewalk selling pictures of the World Trade Center. I mean, the way they might have sold pictures of Martin Luther King or Elvis Presley or something. They're now selling pictures of a building, of the World Trade Center. I think we all miss them in a way. We miss them even though we didn't love them. In death, these buildings are doing more than they ever did in life to bring about world peace, we might say. That, like all martyrs, they loom larger when they're gone than they did when they were with us. And because they are a symbol of loss, but also a symbol of possibility and aspiration and hope, they have more power now than they ever did before to bring about a better world.
A lot of people are interested in rebuilding. I think that there is the effort to say, no, we have not been defeated, and so we're going to build bigger and better. Should we rebuild the buildings the way they were, or should we rebuild them taller? I would have to say absolutely not.
My deepest hope would be to rebuild them exactly as they were.
I heard the other day that 2 million visitors went to the trade centers a year. On that basis alone, they should be rebuilt.
There are a lot of people who are now calling for an end to skyscrapers, who believe that we're not going to want to build very tall buildings in the way we did. I don't think that's true. The skyscraper is one of the great symbols of American culture, American power, American might, and American ingenuity. It's our architectural icon, really, as the pyramids are the icon for Egypt. The skyscraper is the American icon.
Don't think we've seen the last of the skyscraper. I think we've seen the last of that kind of mega planning, because this is now the era of the individual deal maker.
It seems to me that the culture is really moving in a different direction. We're moving towards lower buildings located in exurbia.
If we rebuilt it exactly as it was, it denies the reality of what happened. Makes it sort of all a pretend place that doesn't show you history. Your history is sometimes a very cruel and painful thing. And if you put it back the way it was, it becomes make-believe, it becomes Disneyland. It becomes the world's largest theme park, a pretend place that doesn't have any representation of the horrible things that happened.
If we're going to build on the site, we need to build something great, something world-class that reflects New York City and the world at the beginning of the 21st century.
your city? Next up at 10, New York Stories features the history of the Empire State Building. The feeling and spirit of New York City is embodied in the Empire State Building, a symbol of American ingenuity and Art Deco architecture. Turn on skyscrapers. Metro TV. Turn on New York.